Thanks, guys. So who went to Pearl's talk earlier today? Okay, cool. And I'm really sorry about the confusion in the scheduling. We talked yesterday. We decided she was doing an intro, and I'm doing more of a deep dive into a more specific thing in Angular, so we thought we should switch them around. But thanks for bearing with us, and thanks for coming. So who today who's playing with Angular? Who is getting paid to write Angular? Okay, this is cool. So I'm gonna try to demystify what I thought was one of the biggest pain points in Angular, and that's directives, and writing your own custom directives. And sorry, so I'm Alex Tucker. I'm a technical director at BeatOceans. I also love testing, which is why I write Angular. You can find me on Twitter and on GitHub. And you can deal with these scroll bars that won't come off my slides for some reason. So the reason why you're all here today is because you're at a jQuery conference. And why am I talking about Angular? Well, because even if you're getting paid to write Angular today, you probably have a lot of experience writing jQuery. And you probably have your favorite jQuery plugin. And now you're writing Angular and you don't want to write a weird hack to just use the jQuery plugin that you love. So I wanted to kind of help you guys understand where a lot of jQuery plugins are trying to solve the exact same problem that Angular is trying to solve with directives, and how it's actually really, really easy to transform your existing plugin into an Angular directive. So a lot of jQuery plugins look something like this. So this is actually the carousel plugin from Bootstrap. So you write a bunch of markup, and it kind of describes in a kind of semantic way how the plugin is going to be laid out, how your data actually works in the DOM. And then at the bottom, it's a little script tag, and that's how you transform that piece of DOM into your plugin. This is a very typical pattern you see across a lot of jQuery plugins. What's the difference here? Well, for one, I took out a class and put an attribute on here, and I got rid of that script tag where I invoked it outside. And I just want to prove that Angular directives are really solving the exact same problem most jQuery plugins are. And by the end of the presentation, you're going to see how you can take your existing jQuery plugins and convert them to Angular. So, jQuery's templating system is really, Angular's templating system is really different than what you probably have used in the past. So if you used underscore or handlebars or something like that, they do a lot of string interpolation and render out a JavaScript function, and that's your templating. What Angular does is a lot different. It actually takes your code and puts it in the DOM first, and then actually goes and does the whole two-way data binding magic, and it goes through these steps. So we take your template and we slap it in the DOM, and now we traverse the DOM using the normal mechanisms there, and we try to find the Angular directives in the DOM. And the first time that we locate a directive, we see if there's a reference to that, be it a custom directive or a built-in directive, and we execute the compile function. We only execute it once. It's only run the first time that we encounter that directive while the app is running. That compile function then returns what's called the linking function, and that linking function is run for each instance of that directive. So that sounds scary. And when the first time I read this in the docs, I was like, what the hell's going on? So what we're going to do is I'm going to write some code to show you how this is actually not that complicated, and hopefully show you some of the other little ins and outs of dealing with scope and stuff like that in Angular. So I've already had this kind of set up. So let's start a new directive, and I'm going to call it the let's call it the confirm. Let's make a directive that will make like a button that will show like a confirm box or something. So I'm going to use yoman or yo and use its Angular generator to make a directive called
typo.
Thanks. Confirm. So now, Yoman generated this nice little piece of code for me, and it's right here. And if I open up the view, let's get rid of this. And I'm going to make a confirm tag, which is what we just generated. So if we run this now in the browser, get this statement. So let me explain to you what's going on here. So when Yoman generated the directive, it kind of set up the base boilerplate that you need to get ready. So you call the directive function and you pass in two arguments, a string and the function that will act as a factory to generate your directive. The string is the name of the directive that you want to make. So I made the confirm directive so I can make this custom confirm tag. So I call it confirm. Ignore templates for now. Restrict is an interesting thing. This lets you change the different ways of declaring a directive in Angular. E means restricted to element level. And so an element is, a base tag. And it's not actually the greatest way to write Angular directives, and mainly because IE doesn't support it unless you do these weird hacks. So the most popular way of writing Angular directives is to actually use attributes. So change your restrict to A, and you can do something like this. So because I want to make a button. So now if I go back to the browser, I see this button, and it still is executing the code that's inside this linking function, which we'll get to in a second. You can also do restrict C, which means you can restrict it to a class name, so you can actually do this now. That will still work. It's actually not working. Anyway, I think the most preferred way is to use the attribute style, and that's what we're going to stick with for this demo. So let's look at this linking function. There's three things that are passed in the linking function. One is the scope, the element, and the attributes. So what are these different things? Scope is what you expect from the rest of Angular. It's the one true source of data for your controller. So I'm going to console log these arguments so we can take a look at them and get some context about what goes on inside of them. So the scope that gets passed in is whatever the current parent scope is. this is a good and a bad thing. It's bad in the fact that, you know, if you just keep passing the parent scope in, you're kind of breaking the whole idea of isolating your components, and you should, it's why you have like nested controllers, so you can manage scope in an isolated way. So directives actually support their own scoping. So if you declare a scope attribute, it's a blank scope, you'll notice now that it didn't inherit from the parent, and you can actually control the scope now from inside the directive. But hey, that kind of sucks, because now I don't have access to any other scope's data. So how do you do that? Well, if you look at the built-in attributes in Angular, they usually pass in scope using attributes. So let's make a message attribute, and that's what's going to show up in a confirm dialog later on. So I want to put that message into my scope. So how do we do that? So if you name a parameter inside the scope, there's a few different ways you can restrict the scope. One of them is called attribute level. And what that does, and that's represented by this @ sign, and what that does is takes the string that's inside of that attribute and puts it into the scope under that name. So if I refresh this now, you'll see that now the message is in scope. But let's say that you wanted it in the scope, you wanted to be named something else. You wanted to name it title. So how do I get at the message parameter? You just put the name of the attribute after the @ sign, and it will just take that string and put it into that attribute on the scope. Another thing you can do is you can pass in references from like your existing scopes. So there's a controller that's active on this page that puts this awesome things array in the scope. So let's just make a fake what's it called? Awesome. So I don't want that to be passed in as a string. I want that to be passed in as a reference from another scope. So you don't want to do attribute level. You actually want to do, okay, what's actually called? You want to set up a bidirectional binding. So you'll use, instead of using an @ sign, you'll use an equal sign. Now, check out the scope. It has this things array that was being controlled by the outer scope. And in this case, you know, I could even access that scope and it'll change it globally, which is not always what you want to do. So those are the different ways that you can get data into your scope. And let's move on to looking at this element now. The element's kind of interesting. So the element right now is actually Angular ships with something called jQuery Lite, which is like a really minimal implementation implementation of some jQuery functions. But what you can do is, if you load jQuery before you load Angular, you'll see now that it's a full-blown jQuery object. So if you load jQuery before you load Angular, Angular will throw away its crappy jQuery Lite implementation and just use jQuery instead. And now, everything that you wanted to do in jQuery, you can treat the element as basically a jQuery object. And this is where, transforming your plugin into an Angular directive becomes really, really simple. And I'll get to that in just a minute. The adders element this is just a hash of all the attributes that were on that element. So you can actually choose to not put things into scope and kind of use them in more of a one-off way. But you can also, so you can access them through the attributes and not just through the little fancy scope isolation magic that we were doing before. So let's write out the rest of this little directive. So I have a message, or it's called title now. So let's just use the element, and because now I have like full-on jQuery available to me, I can do like a click and pass in a function. That has my scope.title. So, do you want a horse? Cool. So now, all I have to do is, I can just change this to whatever I want. That's what you're going to get in the confirm model. So I'm going to show you a really kind of trivial example of like how to change an existing jQuery plugin into a directive. So the simplest plugin that will work, I decided I was going to do the tooltip from Bootstrap. So basically, the tooltip is just adding a title attribute to your tag, and when you hover over that little span, you'll get the little tooltip, like this. But the kind of thing that's annoying about this is that you have to always invoke it like directly in your code. So let's pass that responsibility off to an Angular directive. So I'm going to go back to Yo Angular directive. Let's call it tooltip. Awesome. So now Yo went ahead